I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Coaching Question Show on the Coaching Conversations podcast with Jim Knight. This show is for everyone that calls the Instructional Coaching Group home for all your instructional coaching content. These episodes are designed for everyone who desires to think and learn alongside Jim as you continue to make an impact with all the great work you do. I'm Jessica Wise, a consultant with the Instructional Coaching Group. Over 2 episodes, Jim and I will discuss the story of instructional coaching, how moments early in Jim's career inspired him to be curious and explore what we now know as instructional coaching. We'll dive into the early days of Jim's research, the beliefs that undergird his approach to coaching, and what exactly it means to be an instructional coach. Once our Q&A has come to a close, we'll have an epilogue, or a final note at the end of the show, where I ask Jim 2 questions to wrap up our discussion before we sign off. So, on with the show. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Jessica?
I'm well. I'm excited about our conversation.
I'm up here in the great state of Nebraska, looking out on the North Loop River and working on a revision to the instructional coaching books. This couldn't be more timely than for us to talk about this today.
That's exciting. You see what's behind me right here.
I see the book right there, yes.
Yes, and for those of you who are listening, the instructional coaching book is right behind me on my bookshelf, featured. It's the first book I ever bought from you, Jim, and it's been one of my favorites, aside from Better Conversations, actually.
It's all over now. We're doing a new one, so enjoy it while you can. Well, you can
Can't
still enjoy it whenever you want, if you want to call it enjoying.
Right. I'll replace that on my shelf when I get the new one.
Right. We're calling it IC 2.0. That's
I like it. That's the title
nickname.
of the book?
No, it's Instructional Coaching, 2nd edition. But
okay, I like it. So we'll call it the nickname IC 2.0.
Yeah, that's the nickname. That's our go-to nickname. I'll never forget the day I got the book. I remember once I was still writing the book, and Corwin had created a cover for it. And narcissist that I am, I was looking up the book online to see if there's anything out there about it. And somebody was selling the book in England or something, or in Germany, I think. And I was still writing it. I thought, I should write them and get them to send me the book so I don't have to write it. That's funny. It was selling the book. It wasn't even written yet. Well, that's pretty interesting.
Wow. Did you ever get a copy?
Well, it was this book that they were just going to. So I got many copies, yes.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm anxious to see the next iteration. I know you'll do a great job, and we're excited to read it. Okay, well, Jim, before we dive into our topic, I want to take the opportunity to say thank you. The start of my coaching career began with the words we've heard many people speak, and those are, I don't exactly know what I'm doing. When I searched for support, I actually turned to Google, and there you were, Jim. The Instructional Coaching Group and your research, your literature, and your approach to coaching became my North Star, as Brene Brown says. I think I speak for many, many people when I say thank you. To you, your research partners, the good people at the Instructional Coaching Group, and all the coaches and leaders who worked alongside you over the years. With your guidance, I feel like I really found my way as a coach. So I just wanted to take this point of privilege to share my gratitude with you and all that you've contributed to the field. So thank you.
Well, you're very kind, but it is, if you read the book, and I know you've read the book, but when you read the book, each chapter focuses on a coach. We were working with coaches in Topeka, Kansas. Every week I'd spend the week in the schools working with principals and coaches trying to make the coaching program work. We'd get together every Friday afternoon for a decade. And I learned from them every weekend. I mean, the book reflects that. And then there's just an enormous group of people who educated me around things, starting with Michael Fullen and educational change. So the book I'm one small part of it. I brought the pieces together, but the pieces come from other people.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all the people who are out there doing this work, who helped you study instructional coaching. It means so much to so many people. And I know that people say it to you. I've heard them in the Institute, but I wanted to speak for me and all the people who maybe haven't had the chance to say that. So this is an exciting moment in coaching conversations. And I just wanted to take that pause to say thanks for all you do.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for what you do. We're doing great things as a result of you being a part of our group. So I'm very grateful to you.
I'm happy to be here. Well, Jim, over the next 2 episodes of the Coaching Questions episodes, we're going to look at almost 3 decades of work that you've poured into instructional coaching. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with something I've noticed in reading about your journey. And it's something that Michael Bungay Stanier tells us to do. And he always says, stay curious. And that's what you've done. Everything began with you being really curious. The power of curiosity guided you. And because of that, you launched what we now call instructional coaching. So I have 2 questions for you here, Jim. One is, what exactly piqued your curiosity early on? And then to build on that, how did it inspire you to begin this journey?
Well, I think, thank you for those kind words. I think I am a learning kind of person. I like to try new ideas, do new things. I'm the restless trying to get better, individually, personally, and in terms of the work. But for me, the issue really was that my very first class I taught, I was working with these students. They'd all failed communications 3 times. They had learning disabilities. They had a lot of learned helplessness. And I stumbled into these practices, which we'll talk more about later, I suspect, that really made a difference for those students. And they range in age from about 18 to 55. And their whole outlook on life went from what Martin Seligman would call learned helplessness to learned optimism. And when I saw that transformation in my students, they all got together, they wrote a letter to save the course because the course was going to get cut. Of course, it ended up getting an award. I got a full-time job. But I think when you see students succeed who all their life haven't succeeded, and you see this change in their outlook on life from helplessness to optimism, you want to spread the word and you want to get out and do it. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go out and spread the word. But then I found that what I was doing wasn't working at all, and I had to come up with something better. And so I would say the driving force behind the whole thing is how can we set up learning so kids really succeed? All people who learn are successive. And I just found that my professional development, despite my good intentions, was pretty much useless. So I had to come up with something better. And that's kind of where it all started.
And you named one author that you read. But a lot of your research, you quote authors and you talk about books who really inspired you along the way. I wondered if this would be an opportunity for you to talk about some of those people like Michael Fullan who really inspired you and kept you going.
Well, I studied with Michael at the University of Toronto, and I took a course with him, and then he was really generous with his time. I did an independent study. He was writing a book called Change Forces. And every time I sat down with him, he would meet me for lunch, or I'd meet him in his office at the University of Toronto. And I'd be pretty nervous. This is Michael Fullan, for crying out loud. And I went through everything he did, and then he introduced me to a lot of other people, Peter Senge, Peter Block, Margaret Wheatley, who I'm going to talk to later this week. And all those books, all those ideas really led me to people like Rand Eisler, Paulo Freire, and a lot of the work grew out of that. And there's just along the way, there's been probably 20 or 30 different books I've read that have profoundly shaped what we do. So, for example, Prochaska's research on change was really influential in us recognizing we have to help people get a clear picture of reality. Miller and Rolnick's research on alignment and resistance and what leads to real change in therapy helped us think about how we set goals how coaches set goals with teachers. And Peter Block's work was really influential, Margaret Wheatley's work, and then a whole bunch of books on communication like Susan Scott. I mean, I could just go on, but I would say it's got to be hundreds of books that have shaped what we now know. And, right now, today, I'm reading Margaret Wheatley's last 2 books, putting it all together so I can talk to her. And there's more new ideas I'm learning from her. So once Michael Bungay Stanier, he leads these little groups periodically, and he wanted us to start with something we're grateful for. And everybody had their thing. And I said, I'm grateful for the printed word. Because look at how much we can do because of the printed word, how wonderful we can read all these other people's ideas and fit them together with what we do. So kind of a long, rambling response, but there's no question that the books I've read and the people I've interacted with, people like Joellen Killian, Steve Barkley, their work and coaching really shaped me in the early years. Joellen was kind of a champion for the work of instructional coaches and for our work. She was the reason why TLC got started in many ways, because she showed up. It was like the stamp of approval. If Joellen would present at our conference, it must be a half-decent conference. And then Steve's work on coaching really helped me think about questioning and on and on and on.
I think what is so great about what you've said is, so you take all of this great information about instructional coaching and you share it with us, but you also tie in elements like change theory and research from other authors that helps us make it work for education, because you're taking ideas from many different fields and saying, but here's the application to education. Here's how that looks in instructional coaching. So it feels to me, I feel secure in doing the work because I know there are so many elements considered, like how adults learn, because we can't just go out and coach adults without knowing how adults learn. So a lot of your work is based off of elements that really help people like me to make sure I'm doing a good job.
It's kind of cool. It's kind of fortuitous. Like, I think I was presenting in Salt Lake City, and this person came up to me and he said, your work kind of reminds me of, you probably know this stuff, Prochaska's research on change, but he said, it kind of reminds me of that. And then I've never heard of that. So then I looked up Prochaska and I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. And then I was at Randy Sprick's conference about a year later, and I met Wendy Renke, who's a researcher on positive behavior, and she's really an expert. Her and Keith Herman, her partner, they're real experts on motivational interviewing. She said, well, have you ever heard about motivational interviewing? And I'm like, well, I've never heard about that. So then I looked up that and I read all that, and so things just kind of happen. And Michael Fullan got me interested in Peter Block, and then Peter Block's book Stewardship came out. That was a big shaping force in my thinking. So it's kind of, not to get too woo-woo here, but things just kind of fall in place when you need them. That old quotation, something when the teacher's needed, the teacher arrives, or whatever that thing is. It's the same thing with books. When you need the book, it sometimes shows up too.
Well, and you've said before, because I've actually used this quote in professional development, that when teachers stop learning, kids start learning. And I think that you really live that out. You just keep learning, and that helps us stay informed. But I wanted to just share one note. You said that you got nervous when you sat down to work with Michael Fullan. I just want to say that sometimes I feel that way because you're Jim Knight. So I just want to say I'm really happy to hear that you felt that way about Michael Fullan, because sometimes I have those moments.
You should be reaching the point where you realize that it's extremely not a big deal. So
not there yet, but I'm working on it.
Come and trust me.
Okay, Jim. Well, before the term instructional coaching was defined, there were people coaching. They were doing this great work with teachers, maybe not in the same way that we're doing it today, but they were out there giving partnership a go. And you had the opportunity to work with one of these people at Humber College in Toronto. I wondered if you could talk about how this experience shaped you.
Well, when I worked at Humber, I worked with students with learning disabilities. And I also taught a wide range of courses. I did this other really cool course on Toronto has a great literary reading series. So I teach a class every week before the author would show up. So we would sit down and talk about Salman Rushdie or Margaret Atwood or Margaret Lawrence. And then we go see them. It was such a cool thing. And this is before the internet, so I had to go look up all their books on the library. It took me all kinds of, and on the internet, I could have done it in 20 minutes, but it took me a day to do it for this course. But anyway, I taught this other course. The course I was really passionate about was the one I mentioned where the students went from helpless to learned optimism. I think I got the course because I was the least experienced. They said, give it to that guy. I had no idea what I sat down. One kid couldn't spell his name. I mean, their writing was astonishing. But they started to see success. And there's one guy, his name was Isa, and he skipped a couple classes. And there's this guy, Bob Bonspiel. He was a big, strong human being, powerful force. And he walked over to Isa and he said, this is the most important thing you're doing right now. You shouldn't skip class anymore. I'm like, you come to all my classes. But I didn't know what to do. When I looked at the writing samples, I had no clue. But Dee LaFrance was an expert in learning disabilities, and in particular, learning strategies from the University of Kansas. This is in Toronto. She'd gone to Kansas, became a professional developer. And so she was my coach. She helped me plan the lessons. Sometimes she would model lessons. She helped me figure things out. She helped me work through the materials I was using. She was not just a coach in terms of helping me understand how to use the materials, but she embodied belief in the students. So Bob and the other students, I remember them from 30 years ago, they would be competing for a little speller dictionary. Like, it's not that. They wanted her sort of recognition. And she just embodied goodness, and she communicated to every student, I really believe in you. Anyway, I worked with her, and any success I had in that class was a result of working with her. And I learned pretty quickly that it's really helpful to have somebody else help you learn the materials. So I went to Kansas, became a trainer for the strategic instruction model she was sharing, and pretty quickly realized that I had to do something different than what I was doing, and Dee kind of became my model. But she was, mostly it was her, she just beamed goodness towards these kids. And, well, they weren't even kids. I mean, a wide range of ages, and they just ripped it up. They loved it.
That's really nice. As you talk about Dee, I can't help but think of my very first coach. Her name is Sue. And I felt the same way. It's like everything about her just made you feel welcome and warm. The kids loved her. I loved her. She made me feel good and successful. And I always think of Sue when I coach people. I hope to be the next person, Sue. And it sounds like you feel that way about Dee. These people really shape who you are. And so I'm grateful to know about Dee. And I think a lot of people listening are probably thinking of their first coaches too. So big shout out to all those coaches.
Yeah, well, like Michael Fullen, there wouldn't be what I do without him. There wouldn't have been. That's the same thing can be said for Dee. I mean, she really helped me succeed as a teacher. And when I saw that success, I wanted other people to have the same experience.
You talking about Dee makes me think of one of your Jimisms that you say often, which is coaches foster hope. You talk about hope often when we talk about instructional coaching, and it almost feels like it may have originated from that work that you did with Dee.
Well, she certainly gave me hope, for sure. I think the theory of hope I just learned from mostly Shane Lopez, who's another person I could mention, who was a researcher at the University of Kansas. I was fortunate to be a colleague of Shane's, and I always loved running into him. He was such a wonderful mentor for many, many people. I was one of them, but he made a difference in so many lives. So he embodied what he wrote about in his work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jim. Okay, I must say that as I read about your early career and the work you did that laid the foundation for coaching, I really connected about your experience as a professional developer. As you know, that's a passion of mine. That's what I also studied. We both studied this in our dissertation or our doctoral programs.
We've done a podcast people can look up on you talking about your research.
Yes, they can. So like you, my call to begin delivering PD was because I felt really inspired. I was very passionate about teaching. I wanted to share it with others. And I really appreciate how you leverage the beginning of your story about delivering PD with overhead projectors, which you can Google if you're not sure what that looks like. I always laugh when you show pictures, Jim. You even talk about this moment in our institute where you say what you've learned about PD and you go, we sat around the table and said, people might need more than just good professional development. So can you talk about how that moment with your group, or even as you delivered PD, really began to lay the foundation for the partnership approach?
I really believed in the strategies I was sharing. They're very direct instruction kind of strategies, but I really believed in them because I saw the results with kids. And I think that's how you come to believe in something, is you see it work for students. So I saw the results. And I knew there was a massive amount of research that had been conducted on this. And I felt it was my duty to talk about every little piece of research. I was given a stack of overhead slides to use. And I just went through one after the other, and it was kind of like death by overhead. It really was. And I would just talk. Once I was invited to do this workshop, and my person who invited me, he came up to me at the break and he said, I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I think we can just stop right now and keep thinking, because it was like everybody was dying. And so I became fascinated by the issue of that. And part of the thing I did when I showed up was, look, research has been done, and you need to do it the way the research says, or I'm going to take the book back. I mean, I can't trust you to do this unless you promise me you'll do it the way I said. And I learned pretty quickly that me being up here and everybody else being down there wasn't very effective, because people didn't like it. They bristled when I led the workshops. And so taking a directive top-down approach, it just didn't lead to any kind of healthy relationship. So I became kind of consumed with that. And part of that was reading Peter Senge. He really got me thinking about what that looks like, what dialogue looks like. At any rate, I decided I wanted to go to Kansas. I wanted to do my doctorate, left Toronto. I was actually studying English literature, doing a doctorate in English, passed my comps, and then changed my whole discipline, went to Kansas to do a doctorate in education. And I was on this grant And the purpose of the grant was to make classes more inclusive using a set of teaching practices that led to more inclusive learning. And we're sitting around the table, everybody on the grant, and someone at the table, I can't remember who it was, but someone at the table said, if we want these teachers to use these strategies and we're going to test how they work, we're going to have to show them how to do it. We're going to have to meet with them one-to-one, co-plan, model in the classroom. It's not going to work unless we do that. Because if we just do a workshop, they're not going to implement. And somebody at the table said, well, if we know that's true for these teachers, why do we keep doing workshops to spread strategies? Why don't we do something different? And that day was the day everything began. That was the start of everything. And then from that point on, we started to look for grants and find ways to fund our research on instructional coaching.
It was a turning point. It's a really cool moment. And I'm actually going to pause this right here, which is a great place to pause because you're saying that's the turning point. That's where everything began. And that would lead us into our next episode, part 2 of this. So we're going to pause here for today. But we've reached the end of our show, which means we're at our epilogue, Jim. And I want to shake things up a bit today because this is a special 2-part episode. So I really want to do something fun at the end of each one. So are you ready for some fun today?
I am.
Okay. In our virtual instructional coaching institute, we do at the very end of the 16 weeks, we ask our participants to say, I used to think this, but now I know. So Jim, it's your turn. So the first question is, what did you used to think about working with adults? And what do you know now about how to approach that work?
Yeah, I would say I began thinking they should do it the way the research is written up. They should do it with fidelity. And I've come to believe that more important than fidelity is a change in the quality of kids' lives. And you need high-quality implementation. But fidelity isn't necessarily high-quality implementation. I've seen lots of teaching practices that everything was done that was on the checklist and they're boring and spit. What matters is changing kids, which leads to the second thing. I used to think professional development should focus on strategies, but now I think it begins with the students. You start with the students, start with kids, and then once you're there, then you figure out what the strategy is. That's how we learn. When I was trying to be a good runner, I didn't do it backwards. I tried to figure out how the running is going. I knew I had to work on something, and then I started to look at different things I could do. I incorporated it into my practices. And I would say I used to think that people would change and implement if we did workshops. But I've learned it's probably not going to happen. A workshop, you may get a small number of people who implement, but they have to reteach themselves. People start to forget even before the workshop's over. They're forgetting the things. Give them 3 or 4 days, it's gone. So now I'd say I believe you probably need to do coaching if you want to get deep levels of implementation. You probably need somebody who's going to be a learning partner to help you do it. Now, there may be many different ways that can work, but a workshop's probably not going to be enough. Workshops can create awareness. They can let people know about things. You could do a workshop on differentiated instruction or classroom instruction that works. You could look at these practices, but to translate them into real life change that has an impact on kids, you probably need someone like a coach to help you make it happen.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Okay, and then the second question for our epilogue is for you to think about our listeners and our learners, the many people that interact with the instructional coaching group. What's one big idea after part 1 of our episode that you would like to leave them with today?
Well, can I do 2?
Oh, you can do as many as you'd like.
Okay, I'll do 2. Okay, one is, this isn't just my opinion. We've been studying coaching really carefully for 3 decades. We probably won over $30 million in grants at the University of Kansas to study this. We worked for a decade in Topeka, Kansas, the home of Brown versus Board of Education, where we learned a lot about what it looks like to have effective instruction for all kids in the class. Every week, I would meet with our team. We would talk about what worked, what didn't work. Then, as you'll hear next week, we did a lot of different pretty rigorous studies. Initially, we started out pretty informally, but over time, more and more rigorous. And then we had to develop our own models of research. But it's not about, this is my opinion. It's that this is what we found. We found that focusing on strategies isn't as effective as starting with the teachers, because we started by focusing on strategies, but it makes more sense to start with kids. We found that the partnership approach 4.5 times more effective than telling people what to do. And so the one thing I'd want people to take away, and this is what's going to happen in our next conversation, but it's not just an opinion. It's not just, I got this idea. We've been systematically studying it, even creating our own forms of research, what we call lean design research. And we're doing that as best we can because we think that's what's best for kids, to look at what the evidence says and try to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and how to keep moving forward. We started from nothing. I'll never forget the first time I heard somebody say, I'm an instructional coach who wasn't working on our team. I'd never heard anybody use that term before. It had only ever been us. And then I was at, I think, Learning Forward, and somebody said, well, I'm an instructional coach. And I'm like, holy cow, that's our word. And they were using it. Although I'm sure a lot of other people were using the term, we were starting to use it, but there's that. So the one thing I would say I would want people to take away is the idea that this is an evidence-based model, and we're continually, and even now I'm working with coaches every day or once a week to try to coach them and learn about how to make the process even better for the new book, Instructional Coaching. Second thing I'd focus on is, I would say, a big idea I want people to take away is that you need to know if what you're doing works or not. And the way to find out if what you're doing works or not is not to look at a checklist of the teaching practice. It's to say, did the kids change? Do we see a difference in student achievement or student engagement? If what you're doing isn't changing what happens with kids, then it's not working. So you have to make some adjustments and modifications along the way. So I think starting with kids, identifying the goal, and moving forward is really, really a critical piece. It's not enough to just assume it's working. You need to know. And the way to know is to set really clear goals for students and then keep making adaptations and adjustments until you hit those goals. Those are my two things for your one question.
I like them. Those are great. And from those two things, I think one thing I appreciate the most, Jim, is, like I said, you're a learner and we see that, but you also really keep the focus on the kids, even from your first interaction with your first coach, D, before coaching was a term, all the way to now, it's focused on the kids. Instructional coaching is student focused. Well,
it is, but if you go back to the book Instructional Coaching, we didn't talk about goals. It was really about learning strategies, and we didn't talk even about SMART goals. Now, we tried SMART goals; it didn't work. We moved to what we call Pearce goals, but in the early days, it was really like, hey, I got this cool thing. Do you want to try it out and see what happens? And so we were trying to get people to do strategies. And it's when we saw low quality implementation and that the change wasn't sustaining, then we said, really, the change needs to start with kids. It just evolved from the way in which we were doing our research.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you. And thanks for sharing those two things. And I'm excited, Jim, to continue our conversation, to continue to let the story of instructional coaching unfold in part 2 of our episode. So thank you for all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
Right. Next time in part 2 of our podcast about the story of instructional coaching, you can look forward to hearing Jim talk about the term instructional coaching and how it came to be, his research and the various studies that shaped his coaching approach, the beliefs that emerge from his work, and how dialogical, one-on-one conversations are the powerful ingredients for instructional coaching. I hope you tune back in for part 2. If you found today's episode helpful, it would help us if you liked or followed the podcast. You can leave us a rating or a comment so we can continue to create meaningful content just for you. Thank you, and until next time, go forth and lead great coaching conversations. Jim, thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to the next one. Thanks. As always, Jessica, looking forward to the next conversation.
Can't wait.